everyone. I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles. The series of books and videos on American history is seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of James Buchanan, and the focus is presidential duties and investigations. The year is 1857. Bleeding Kansas and the Lecompton Constitution clearly dominated the first year of the Buchanan presidency, and in fact, even after that Constitution was denied by Congress and Kansas would remain a territory for the balance of Buchanan's term, there was still a lot of simmering tensions. There were some elements of violence going on, so he never took his eyes too much off of Kansas. But there were other challenges for Buchanan as well, including in another territory, just a little bit further west, the territory of Utah. This was where you had Governor Brigham Young, who not only was the territorial governor, but also the leader of the Mormon Church, whose population dominated the Utah territory. In fact, they operated pretty independently from much of the rest of the country, including some of their own cultural components that were very different, including the adoption of polygamy, which was pretty widespread in Utah. This was offensive to many Americans who wanted the practice stopped, including James Buchanan. There were also challenges in the court system because you had the U.S. federal courts and U.S. law, but you also had religious courts, Mormon courts that were set up in the territory. Sometimes they were at odds. In fact, some federal officials felt threatened and decided to flee for their safety, all of which were warning signs for President James Buchanan. He decided to make a change. Brigham Young needed to go. We needed to bring in a new territorial governor, change some of these practices, get rid of polygamy. Well, this was also not going to be easy, finding someone who could take on this role. And in fact, several people turned Buchanan down before he got Alfred Cummings of Georgia to agree. Cummings was dispatched for the transfer of power to take over in Utah. He had some U.S. military presence going along with him. And when Brigham Young heard about all of this, he decided not to go quietly. He declared martial law. He called out the militia in Utah, to which James Buchanan, the President of the United States, responded, Governor Young has by proclamation declared his determination to maintain his power by force and has already committed acts of hostility against the United States. Unless he should retrace his steps, the territory of Utah will be in a state of open rebellion. Well, in fact, there were skirmishes throughout the Utah territory over the next several months, and things calmed a little bit, but that was just because the winter season set in and it was impractical to have more skirmishes because of the weather. But once the spring of 1858 rolled around, you had more skirmishes. Travelers were not safe going through the Utah territory, at which point James Buchanan decided to put his foot down. He called for a peace commission. He sent peace commissioners to go negotiate with Young, and he did it with carrot and stick. On the carrot side, he offered pardons. No harm, no foul, we'll go about our business. On the stick side, he sent 2,000 U.S. soldiers with this peace commission to make it clear that he was ready to put the force of the U.S. military behind settling this conflict in Utah. Well, with that show of force, Brigham Young decided to back down. He accepted the pardons. He had the transfer of power, and all of a sudden, peace was restored in the Utah territory. Same time, the American economy was suffering, and this also pervaded much of the Buchanan presidency. It took a pretty bad hit. Same old story. Excessive speculation, fueled by paper money. The country had seen it before. This time it was the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company that fell first. Many financial houses followed. The worst was in the West, because the West was particularly focused on using credit and paper money to try to pursue its ends and try to build up this new area of the country. The South was the least impacted in this regard, but still, this was a national panic. It was a problem for the entire administration, but there was not much sympathy coming from President James Buchanan. He labeled his policy in this area reform, not relief. Reform, not relief. He offered some new policies about safer holdings and the amount of specie that these financial houses would have to maintain, but he didn't offer relief for the existing suffering population because that's not what he viewed as the role of the federal government. His reading of the Constitution, his view of the federated system of federal and state responsibilities, providing relief to struggling citizens in an economic realm, which is fairly common in modern day in the United States, was still not the norm. It was by far the exception for presidents to consider that to be an acceptable response. Buchanan's view, as had others in the past, like Martin Van Buren in the Panic of 1837, was just got to let the economy work itself out. Eventually things will right themselves. Buchanan had very limited foreign policy during his presidency, despite all of his diplomatic experience coming in. There wasn't much engagement on an international front. He, like other presidents, including his immediate predecessor, had an interest in Cuba, perhaps, maybe Spain will finally be willing to sell. He had John Slidell, his close friend, senator from Louisiana, putting some feelers around in the United States Congress on this topic, but Spain wasn't interested in any entreaties along this line. No change there. And Congress wasn't willing to really fight for it much either, so that initiative died fairly quickly. Buchanan also had challenges on the southern border of the United States with Mexico. Mexican leadership continued to undergo relatively constant change. There was turnover and turmoil, particularly in the northern area of the country, right near the U.S. border. It was pretty much chaos, and James Buchanan thought he and the United States should do something about this, perhaps even invade Mexico to create peace and stability in this part of the region that could be affecting the United States. Buchanan sent a message to Congress along these lines in which he said an adjoining republic is in a state of anarchy and confusion from which she has proved wholly unable to extricate herself. She is entirely destitute of the power to maintain peace upon her borders or to prevent the incursions of banditti into our territory. She is now a wreck upon the ocean, drifting about as she is impelled by different factions. As a good neighbor, shall we not extend to her a helping hand to save her? In other words, invade, establish some peace and stability to help the neighbor. Well, this was not American tradition. American tradition was neutrality, not to get involved in these local skirmishes. And frankly, the United States Congress had little interest in this endeavor either. There would be no invasion of Mexico to establish peace on the border. They would protect the border, but no incursions into the neighboring country on Buchanan's watch. Most of this were all sideshows to Kansas, the failure of the Lecompton Constitution, the failure of Kansas to become a state, and the electorate was not happy with the Buchanan administration and the Democrats. In fact, the Democrats were hammered in the midterms over these failures. They lost 26 seats in the House, they lost the majority in the House, they also lost a number of state houses. And Buchanan actually had an interesting reaction to all of these defeats. He wrote a letter to Harriet Lane that said, "Well, we have met the enemy and we are theirs. Yesterday we had a merry time of it, laughing among other things over our crushing defeat. It is so great that it is almost absurd." Interesting take by the president. Well, the new Congress was going to be opposed to almost any administration legislation that was being proposed, so it wasn't much of a domestic agenda for the last 2 years of Buchanan's term, but it actually got worse because that new Congress decided to investigate the president. John Covode was an abolitionist Republican from Buchanan's home state of Pennsylvania, an outspoken critic of Buchanan. And he started accusing the president of misconduct, improper influence with Congress, failure to enforce the law, very broad charges. But you know what? Let the investigations begin. That's what Covode really had in mind. The oversight of the executive branch had been fairly common. There had been some confrontations, little political skirmishes between the branches over time, but certainly there had been an oversight capability that the Congress had assumed over time of the executive branch. But formal investigations into the president had been pretty rare to this point in history, and frankly, James Buchanan was appalled at this. He was angry, especially after Covode was placed in charge of the investigation. Buchanan wrote to Congress, "To make the accuser the judge is a violation of the principle of universal justice and is condemned by the practice of all civilized nations. Every free man must revolt at such a spectacle." But then Buchanan actually stepped a little further. "I defy all investigation. Nothing but the basest pure perjury can sully my good name." Well, this last part of "I defy all investigation," that sent up warning signals in Congress, including Congressman John Sherman of Ohio, who bounced back with, "The doctrine set up by the President of the United States in this message is the same under which Europe was governed for 1,000 years, that the king can do no wrong. This doctrine is, in my judgment, the very worst that has been enunciated since the foundation of this republic." So the battle lines were drawn as this investigation was launched. Well, Buchanan's mood hit a rock bottom as nearly 100 witnesses were paraded in front of this committee, most with scores to settle with Buchanan, full of innuendo, actually very little in terms of real substance. Certainly nothing that was impeachable came from many of these witnesses. And eventually the inquiry died. The Covode Committee realized They didn't have an impeachable offense here, but this was embarrassing to Buchanan, who frankly decried the entire exercise. He felt vindicated, frankly, at the end. He took a bit of a victory lap, and he had a pretty lengthy public statement, including words of caution. According to Buchanan, a bad precedent rarely, if ever, dies. It will, I fear, be pursued in the time of my successors, no matter what may be their political character. Should secret committees be appointed with unlimited authority to range over all the words and actions and, if possible, the very thoughts of the president, with a view to discover something in his past life prejudicial to his character from parasites and informers, this would be an ordeal which scarcely any mere man since the fall could endure. It would be to subject him to a reign of terror from which the stoutest and purest heart might shrink. I have passed triumphantly through this ordeal. My vindication is complete. Well, James Buchanan certainly would not be the last president to be raked over the coals by the United States Congress in partisan fashion. Overall, this was a pretty sad spectacle. It was purely political. And even though Buchanan did claim vindication, it was another low point in his administration. And indeed, it was a pretty troubling precedent for those successors, which of course are stories for another day. That is James Buchanan, Presidential Duties and Investigation. From the life of James Buchanan. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.